Welcome to the Irish Farmers Journal Weekly Podcast.
Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. I'm Hannah Quinn-Mulligan, news correspondent with the Irish Farmers Journal. Coming up on the show this week, no surprises as Teagasc report that dairy continues to drive farm incomes.
If you take dairy out of it, the average income increase across the other systems was much lower at about 9%. So the very strong performance of the dairy sector in 2017 really drove the increase in average incomes. As I said, there was a 65% increase in average dairy farm income year on year.
And for many of us, it's the smell of summer. But did you know that slurry can also be used to generate energy?
We're looking at an all-round solution for farmers that are in trouble with nitrates or slurry storage, or they want another solution as regards heat or power. For example, on a chicken farm you might have a high heating load, or on a dairy farm for milking you'll have a high power input at various stages at the day, whether it's morning or evening milking.
But first, as previously reported, Ireland is the first EU country to be granted beef access to China. It's an important move for beef farmers, and our correspondent Thomas Hubert travelled to China on a Board Be a Trade mission last week, where he spoke to the EU Agriculture Commissioner and Kilkenny man Phil Hogan about the potential for the Irish market.
Well, it's great that China has agreed to open the beef market to the European Union. Of course, it's wonderful news for the Irish beef farmers and the industry that Ireland is the first country in a long, long time that has qualified for access of their beef products to China. We've had a number of meetings with various ministers this week and officials, and I expect that other member states will follow in 2018, and hopefully France, the Netherlands and Germany are likely to be leading contenders. There is an 8 million tonnes deficit in beef requirement in China. This is the equivalent of the total production of beef in the European Union. So it should give some sense of the size of the market that we're talking about and the potential that is there. It comes at a good time for Ireland because of the diversification that's required in the context of beef farmers in the future, perhaps because of Brexit. And it also replaces some of the possible market share that we lost to the Russian embargo some years ago. So China and Japan and Asia generally is going to fill a very important gap in the future for many of our important commodities in the European Union.
One concern of the companies working here is that they might get caught in this developing trade war between the US and China and prospects of rising tariffs. You were quite reassuring to them in talks you had with the exporters here. Why is that? What's your view of the situation?
I think at the end of the day, business has to be pragmatic in the United States and China in terms of reaching an accommodation on trade matters. And this will feed into the political system in the United States and China in terms of trying to get a deal. The United States wants to reduce its deficit with China, which is, of course, understandable. But at the end of the day, I don't think that anyone gains from a trade war. And hopefully there will not be any escalation of the trade differences between the United States and China arising from steel and aluminium products, because the European Union may end up suffering collateral damage.
While we're seeing an opportunity here for beef, of course there's always questions about allowing beef inside the EU on the Mercosur side of things. What's happening there? Any next steps coming up in these talks?
Well, the talks have been going on since 20 years nearly now, so your guess is as good as mine at this stage about when the Mercosur authorities and the four countries are going to align themselves together in order to do business with the European Union on terms that we have negotiated with them up to now. Member states and the European Parliament give a mandate to the Commission to negotiate on their behalf, and with the sensitivity of beef and ethanol is reflected in that mandate. So we are waiting to see what Brazil and the other three countries are going to do, and we're waiting since December. So there are many outstanding issues from the European side that have yet to be resolved. But of course, I would say to Irish farmers and European farmers, that if we do business with Mercosur, it will take 10 years to implement. The immediate opening of the market to China comes into effect immediately, and also we have 65,000 tonnes that we're going to export in due course to Japan. We're going to have unlimited access of beef to Mexico within 5 years, And we have doubled our beef exports from the European Union to 61,000 tonnes to Hong Kong in the last 2 years. So I think we should be positive in relation to the future of our exports to Asia and to Mexico. And we let Mercosur take care of itself in due course whenever we have to make these difficult decisions.
You're going back home to, I suppose, a discussion that started in April on the CAP budget, and that will be ongoing for the next more than a year until it's settled. But you've said it's a lot to do with Brexit, the lack of funding, the need to have some level of CAP cuts. At the same time, you've seen other programs like Erasmus, international aid increase. Would you say you've fought hard enough for agriculture in the initial proposal of the Commission?
Well, you know, the European Commission cannot run a deficit like a member state. So if you're down 12 billion euro, you know, it's not a great start for the total EU budget. So the big programmes like cohesion and agriculture then come into the firing line. And I have spent not the month of April 2018 working on this budget, but the last year and a half in, meeting prime ministers, of which I met 14 in the last year and a half, meeting all of having bilateral talks with all of the ministers for agriculture to reinforce the message to them that in the absence of member states putting more money into the EU budget, that there would have to be, initially in the opening proposal, a reduction in the CAP budget. The fact that I was able to keep it as low as 4% for direct payments at a time when many other member states thought it should be 15% in nominal terms, I think was a good opening position. And this is a commitment I gave to Irish farmers in Kilkenny in recent weeks, that I would fight hard to for the budget, but I did say that there would be some reduction in the budget. When the member states now come to negotiating these final outcomes, we will see can we close this gap. And I'm very heartened by the number of member states like France and Ireland and other member states that have said that there should be no cut in this common agricultural policy budget, and I will be the first person to say that this would be a wonderful result if it happens.
We heard earlier this month from Minister Michael Creed that he does expect changes from the initial proposal. Would that be your view as well? That it won't be the final result?
Well, he and his colleagues in the member states have to decide that. And we already see 5 countries that don't want to pay another euro into the EU budget. And it has to be achieved by unanimity. It has to be a unanimous agreement. So if we can convince the Danes and the Dutch and the Swedes and the Austrians that they need to put more money into the European Union budget, of course agriculture will benefit proportionally.
Final point on dairy markets. There was another release of SMP from intervention at 11.50 a tonne, where the EU price is more like 1,400. Is it sustainable? Is it okay to give a signal that we're releasing under the market price?
Well, I think there's a little bit of hypocrisy about this issue. On the one hand, processors are asking to know when is it going to be sold, because they are saying that this is an overhang in the market. In my view, they may be using this as an excuse in order to lower price, because we are not releasing product in any way that's doing damage to the market, because we have record exports of skim milk powder from the fresh milk supplies that we have in 2018, and it's the exports of skim milk powder is going up significantly in the last 2 years. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to move this product, but we are at pains to point out to farmers that this should not be used as an excuse by processors to reduce their price, because we're doing it in a way that is not displacing in any way export opportunities that are available for fresh milk. And I want to assure farmers that we will continue to act prudently in the release of skim milk powder in order to minimise any impact to the farm gate price.
We hope that you're enjoying this Irish Farmers Journal podcast. Find out more at farmersjournal.ie.
Well, we didn't give our poor news correspondent Thomas Hubert much of a chance to get over the jet lag, because he went straight back to the news battle lines this week and spoke to Teagasc economist Emma Dillon about their National Farm Survey. The survey results were announced on Tuesday, and there were no surprises to see that dairy was still driving farm incomes.
So farm income increased 32% on average year on year, but that was very much driven by the very strong performance of the dairy sector, where the average farm income was €86,000. So I suppose that's really the key driver. We also saw increases on the sheep and tillage farms. Tillage farm incomes increased by about 20% and sheep farm incomes were up 8%. So I suppose if you take dairy out of it, the average income increase across the other systems was much lower at about 9%. So the very strong performance of the dairy sector in 2017 really drove the increase in average incomes. As I said, there was a 65% increase in average dairy farm income year on year.
And I suppose that the average farm income you come at, it's just over €30,000 per year last year for an average farm in Ireland. If you take out dairy, it is much lower, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I suppose it's important to say that. So we're seeing a 32% increase overall. But if you think about it, 2/3 of the farms, their incomes have remained relatively stable. So there's been very little change on the cattle farms in particular, and an increase on the sheep farms, but very much driven by the introduction of the sheep welfare scheme.
You've just mentioned the cattle farms, and especially suckler farms, the cattle rearing category in the farm survey, that they are most dependent on payments. They are very much least profitable in themselves. What's the ratio between how much they get in farm payments and how much they make commercially?
The market income on the cattle rearing side is marginally negative. There's some increase there's some positive marginal return on the cattle other farms year on year. So they're receiving a direct payment of about €16,000 on the cattle other farms. Direct payment marginally lower than that, and on the cattle rearing farms the figure is about €12,000 with direct payments slightly higher.
Okay, so actually making less money than the farm payment allows to cover, so they're in fact subsidising the farm with the farm payment and losing money on the commercial side.
On the cattle rearing side, yes, it's a negative market return. There's some positive marginal return for the cattle other farms. But you're right, and that has been the situation for some time. And I suppose a lot of these farms are involved in GLOS, and they're receiving other payments from Pillar 2 as well.
You've mentioned tillage as well, and we were very much worried for tillage farmers the last year or two when prices were down, and so was their income. You notice recovery in 2017, and when you classify farms between viable, sustainable or vulnerable, I noticed that a lot of the tillage farms were in the viable category. So how are they managing, and how have they sort of pulled themselves into this more viable category?
Yeah, I suppose 2016 was a particularly poor year for tillage farmers, where we saw lower prices and yields. So we saw some improvement in that in 2017, and I suppose that's pushed up the average. The tillage area has reduced, and because of that we saw a lot of cost savings on the average tillage farm. So relative to the size, obviously you're going to see, when there's a size reduction, a reduction in the costs of fertiliser, seed, crop protection. So a lot of those cost categories have reduced year on year, but very much linked to the smaller tillage area. The tillage area, the CSO have said, was down 3% last year, and that's coming through in our survey as well.
Now, when those farmers invest and borrow, what's the picture there? I suppose dairy farms are the ones moving the most investment and the most debt. Are they still in a sustainable position from that point of view, and what about the other sectors as well?
Yeah. The debt-to-income ratios are relatively healthy, really, at 1.06 on the dairy farms. So they are borrowing relatively more than the other systems. I think 50% of all investment on farm in 2017 was on dairy farms, and I suppose that's reflected in the debt figures as well.
And is that debt level all right? Is it not too high in terms of being able to repay, especially if milk prices go down, as we've seen in the last few months?
That's the thing. I suppose the debt-to-income ratio looks relatively healthy this year, but that's based on a very good income and a very good milk price. When I say this year, I mean 2017, obviously. So for 2018, we would envisage that there would be, maybe some issue around cash flow later in the year on foot of the fodder crisis and increasing costs. So I suppose what we've seen is an increase on the dairy side in terms of investment in buildings, and also an increased expenditure in terms of labour as well. So I think what we've seen is that they've used the extra money that they've had in 2017 to fund that kind of spending. So investment hasn't gone up, very much. We're seeing that the investment increased more proportionately on those farms who are expanding. But I think relative to European counterparts, the debt levels are okay. And I suppose it is important to say, of course, that the income level was very good this year, and so for that reason the debt to income ratio looks okay.
Finally, still on investment, you've noticed a drop on cattle farms. What does that tell us about their frame of mind, how they see the future?
Yeah, I think that very much jumped out. As I said, 50% of investment in 2017 took place on the dairy farms, and I think much lower levels on sheep farms were actually up, but the cattle farms were down, as you say, and I think that really points to pessimism within that sector. And I think it is very stark. I suppose it's positive on the sheep side. We saw a 37% increase in investment year on year, linked perhaps to the sheep welfare scheme and sheep handling facilities and all of those things. We saw a decline on the tillage farms as well around land improvement, but again very much to do with the reduced tillage area on farms. So I suppose, yes, certainly the investment levels are down on the cattle side, and again I would say, given that the economic return for these farms is relatively lower, that's not very surprising.
You're listening to the Irish Farmers Journal podcast.
Now, those of you lucky enough to get away to Balmoral Show last week might have been able to attend the Irish Farmers Journal breakfast event. MEP Jim Nicholson was at the breakfast event, where he was interrupted by our correspondent Peter McCann, who asked him to outline the concerns of a future trade deal with Brazil.
I think my first point is farmers have got to realise there's more consumers than there are producers. So the consumer will always be in the top position. Certainly as far as Brazil is concerned, they have two different kinds of farms. They have what is the local farm for local consumption, and then there's these large farms. The farm I was on killed last year 112,000 cattle in 1 year. To date, when I was there at Easter this year, they'd killed 20,000. They've got their own vets, they've got their own agronomists, and nobody can tell me that these people will not be pushing us whenever they get all of their act together, when they get their psychosanitaries and their controls all in place. I think then that will be a very difficult time for our suckler and beef producers, because there's no way we can compete with the climate they have and their ability to grow grass.
How do we address that? Like, obviously Brexit's coming up. Is it some sort of further support for a suckler farmer and a new farm support scheme after Brexit, or what's
Well, there was discussion here this morning about that. Is how you do it. Do you put it on the cow or you put it on the calf? For me, I would go for the calf, but I think it's an oversimplistic situation.
Yeah.
And the truth is, if you do away with the suckler section, then you'll have no beef section left, and you'll be dependent on the dairy herd, and they cannot supply the calves as required to produce good beef. So then you will be leaving yourself wide open to imports coming in from outside.
Jim, at the minute there, obviously you're in Brussels a lot. You know what's going on. The cap reform debate's going on. Is how do you, or what should Northern Ireland farmers be thinking about that? Is it irrelevant now at this stage of Brexit, or is it still something we need to focus on and just see what's going on in Europe, or is it something that we could potentially model off after Brexit, although that's probably not what farmers voted for when they wanted to leave?
Well, I'm sure that's not what they voted for, but I think the farmers voted for an awful lot of things that they didn't get out of Brexit. But as far as I am concerned, if you don't have a good CAP, you won't have a good UK farming policy if it is different. So I think the two will run concurrently. I've been in Europe for 28 years. I've never seen the UK harmonised down. They've always harmonised up into a stronger position. So I would think we will be regulating pretty along similar lines to that of the rest of Europe, and we would have got to do that on the regulatory basis, and that is where the secret will be. I've watched all this before. It's always down to budgets. It's always down to the budget will end up being king. So let's see what the end result will be, and that will be in the next European Parliament. I'll not be part of that, but the next European Parliament and the next Commission will be making those decisions, the final decisions on the cap reform. But I think you'll see quite an interesting reform coming forward.
Jim, last thing, the ongoing Brexit talks, customs union, what's your thoughts? Or is it a matter of the UK just staying until we get everything sorted out, or like what is the thinking in Brussels, and what is your own thoughts on just what type of shape some sort of Brexit is going to take, or if there's going to be a deal, is there?
Well, I don't have the crystal ball any more than anybody else to tell you what the final shape will be. I'm pretty certain there will be a solution, there will be a deal to it, I found at the end of the day, because anything other than that would be absolute disaster for not only for Europe but also for the UK. So I believe there will be an end result. There will be some sort of a customs union deal, I believe, put together. The question will be how workable is it and how costly it will be to interpret. But I'm pretty certain there will be a deal, and I think it'll go down to the wire in October. maybe even shoot through the wire. But I think you can be certain that in the longer term there's going to be change, but at all times of adversity there's opportunity, so one has to be positive as well as and pragmatic as well as everything else.
Stay tuned, because still to come you can learn all about putting your slurry to use on something other than fertilising fields, and a report all the way from sunny Kentucky.
In this week's Irish Farmers Journal, 2017 farm incomes are up, driven by dairying, but beef, sheep and tillage sectors are struggling with a heavy reliance on direct payments. Fears that 99,000-tonne Mercosur beef deal is only days away. BPS figures confirm 30,000-acre drop in tillage. Also in this week's Farmers Journal, don't miss your free 64-page agribusiness report in association with KPMG, which reveals how the changing consumer will affect how you farm. Inside this week's Irish Farmers Journal, on sale today.
There could be a new use for all that slurry being created by the ever-expanding dairy herd in this country. Alchemy Utilities is a recently set up company that aims to create energy from drying slurry and using it in anaerobic digestion, or AD for short. Our veteran correspondent Thomas Hubert spoke to their technical manager Éanna Tiernan.
So we see our dry AD system as a potential solution to alleviate a lot of the slurry problems in farms around the country. So whether you're in chicken, dairy, beef, pigs, we can adopt our technology to solve problems there. So we can process anything between 5 and 9 tonnes of slurry a day, depending on the dry matter of what organic material we're processing. So for on-farm solution, we're obviously able to produce biogas and process the slurry, but the best part of our technology is that we can actually dry out the slurry and extract nitrogen out of it, and we're looking at making a combined compound fertiliser out of the digestate and the nitrogen, which will be processed through the pre-treatment unit at the front end. So yeah, we're looking at an all-round solution for farmers that are in trouble with nitrates or slurry storage, or they want another solution as regards heat or power. For example, on a chicken farm you might have a high heating load, or on a dairy farm you might have for milking you'll have a high power input at various stages at the day, whether it's morning or evening milking. So we see it as a perfect solution to the agricultural industry in Ireland.
When we talk about biogas and AD, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is big projects that require farmers to come together, go through complex projects with developers and find finance and build something really expensive on their farm if they want to go that way. Is that what you're doing, or is it something different?
No, so our technology is modular in size, so it's quite small, so it can fit on a 25 metre by 25 metre concrete pad. The digesters come in a 40-foot truck that can be just unloaded with a crane and dropped, and you can be up and running in a couple of days. We see wet AD, it's not financially viable. According to some of the farmers that we met already, they looked at the technology even as far back as 10 or 12 years ago. So to see our system in dry AD as a potential solution, because with wet AD you have to dilute the slurry, and the digestate at the back end, you nearly have more water material to get rid of at the back end than you started with, whereas with our system you can get rid of it off farm, and we'll be able to process it from there. So you're alleviating the problems from the farm.
And in terms of the responsibility for the investment, how much of that are you taking on yourself?
So we'll be taking on 100% of the investment. So we're looking at various sites throughout the country, and we'll be funding all the machinery, all the kit. We'll be looking for farmers to provide us with slurry, so we'll have to look at that with a standard. If we're processing cattle slurry, we're looking at 9 cubes a day, which is roughly about 2,000 gallons of slurry, which is kind of the standard size of a slurry tank in Ireland at the minute. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for farmers to partake in these projects.
When do you think you'd be going out to farmers and starting to offer them this option?
So we're looking at starting our first project during the summer as a demonstration unit. We have plans for a couple of more pilot projects, and then within the next, I'd say, 18 to 24 months, we'll be looking at rolling out this across the country and getting different parties involved, whether you're in pigs, dairy, beef. Like, all we need is 2,000 gallons of slurry a day for a plant. So we don't need a huge amount of slurry, which is beneficial because it's so efficient. We don't need that much, but we still need enough that can alleviate problems throughout the year. We see it as the ideal solution to even decarbonise the Irish agricultural industry, because we'll be extracting the gas. We've all heard about problems with emissions from cattle and pigs and nitrates and everything else and phosphates. So we see this as an ideal solution, even for the water directives and nitrates directives as well. So it's ticking a lot of boxes.
You're listening to the Irish Farmers Journal podcast.
Now, it's been a hairy time for sheep farmers, with margins being sheared off the price of wool. And I have run out of puns. But our news correspondent Peter McCann was at an Ulster Wool meeting in Ballycastle and spoke to the chief executive of British Wool Marketing Board, the parent company of Ulster Wool, about prices.
Well, prices generally for our type of wool, crossbred wool, have stabilised over the last 12 months. If anything, we've seen some price appreciation over the last 4 or 5 auctions. Their prices are up 5%. And I think on balance, most people would say now for the next 12 months, we might see some gentle price appreciation. So that's like short-term outlook.
What is driving that, Joe? What's maybe pushing prices up?
I think it's a number of factors. I think that China in particular is starting to recover a bit in demand there. People are looking to, merino has got so expensive now that people are looking to make products as alternatives that have crossbred wool. So there's a bit of substitution going on. And I just think that, the Chinese consumer market's recovering. And I think also there's been a stock overhang in New Zealand. And that's starting to work clear now a little bit. So supply's tightening. It's for crossbred wool, so that's driving the price a little bit.
And Joe, obviously in the last few months you have rebranded the British Wool presence in Northern Ireland as Ulster Wool. You've started a young farmer scheme where young entrants get paid up front for the first 2 years and then gradually over 3. And also you have opened the intermediate depot in Tyrone and Newton Stewart. So these are a few initiatives there, even particularly pointed towards Northern Ireland. You are calling out your competitors for wool prices. You made some comments too about wool pricing. So what is it? 30% you're saying on average? And is that message getting through to farmers, do you think? Or
no, I think we need to try harder. To say we have a 30% price advantage on average over the competition, and for me that's a big thing. But I don't think a lot of farmers realise it. There's a lot of apathy around wool. And we need to break through that apathy and get our message across. So we are planning to be more visible in the ag markets, more visible at shows over here, particularly in the west of the province, where we've been a bit quiet latterly, just to get our message across. Because we need to shout a bit louder.
And the last thing, Joe, a farmer made the comment tonight, really, if you do increase your supply in Northern Ireland and I suppose across the UK, are you fit to market that wool, or is that likely to drive the price down for the farmer? Or
No. I get more channeling more wool through us and our auctions means that the wool can be sold from one point rather than being sold. That we're not altering the actual supply of wool. That it's just the way it's being sold and channeled. So the wool is static. The wool supply, crossbred wool, in the UK and globally static. So we're not changing supply and demand. We're just the more wool that goes through us, the more we can benefit from, or as producers, from collective selling power through one point of that type of wool, and it can only be for the good in terms of selling prices.
We hope that you're enjoying this Irish Farmers Journal podcast. Find out more at farmersjournal.ie.
Our Irish country living reporter Ciara Lee was in sunny Kentucky this week, where she attended an Alltech conference and spoke to Ian Lahav, who is based in Beijing. She asked him the all-important question about what Chinese consumers are looking for.
I think the first thing about the consumers is that the millennial generation are very, very different to the older generations in China. Firstly, they don't cook as much as the older generations do, so they like eating out and they like ordering in. And the amazing change is that pork would have been the main meat and part of the diet for the elder generation. Among the younger people, beef is the first choice amongst meat. So this is driving huge trends of new types of beef consumption.
And why is that? Why pork to beef?
I think first of all, one aspect is pork is maybe seen as a little bit unhealthy, and that beef is seen as a more high quality protein. That's one aspect, and the second is just consumer tastes are changing, and beef is seen as more of a status symbol. And the growing middle class, more people eat beef, and the country people in China eat pork.
I thought it was very interesting as well what you were saying that you know here in Europe and America it's all about buying local and locally sourced, but they don't have that attitude in China.
No, not at all. It's a global marketplace. If they want the best beef, currently they might think it's Australian or the ones they're used to, but now we're hoping that Irish grass-fed beef will be to the forefront of their minds.
Very good. Now, obviously, there was a bit of an Irish focus, and with government regulations, when the Chinese authority came to Ireland, their trip wasn't perhaps as long as we would have liked. And we have 3 Irish plants now important to China. But do you see a lot more potential for Irish beef in China?
I see huge potential. It's a step-by-step process. So obviously, the first 3 plants will set the standard, and obviously Ireland's traceability programs and Origin Green has given the Chinese authorities a lot of confidence. I also think there's probably opportunities for inward investment from China. Maybe Chinese companies might come in and buy local processing plants, and certainly think that's something to think about, and that again would increase the volume. But it's also, from a regulatory perspective, currently we're only allowed to sell unboned meat under 30 months to China, and obviously we'd love to get to a point where the full carcass could go and you could start to get real volumes and real value, because the carcass, some of the parts of the carcass in China will get a higher value because of the consumption habits compared to maybe in traditional Western markets.
Okay, very good. Now, there are a lot of markets with interest in China, but I suppose given the conference we're at over here in Kentucky, it is apt to look at the American market and its potential in China. So I suppose, first of all, Ian, what is the potential and equally the barriers that impact America? And secondly, given the size of their industry, is there room for us all?
That's a great question. The first thing, I suppose, is that in 2003, when US had their BSE crisis, they had half of the import market in China. So US beef was seen as a great status symbol and very well liked in China at the time. But obviously 14 years have passed and consumer habits have changed, and other markets and other countries have gotten in there. The challenges for the US really come in two areas. One is around hormones, growth hormones that are very, very strictly banned by the Chinese authorities. It's a sensitive point. And the second is traceability. So the US doesn't have a national herd book, and they don't have a traceability system. And if you look at the US Meat Council's analysis, only 3% of the herd would meet China's natural or the hormone requirements, and 15% would currently meet the traceability requirements. So it requires the US beef industry to make a decision. Are they going to go down the route of transparency and traceability for the promise of the potential of the Chinese market, or are they going to say, well, we're actually okay with our domestic market and selling a little bit to Japan and to their other markets where they've established relationships? So
what do you think they're going to do?
I think they're very much at crossroads. The Chinese have been very entrepreneurial. A lot of them have been, they've come over and done deals in Montana, Nebraska, Kansas and Texas, buying processing facilities and sort of taking control. So I think if the US guys can focus on the cattle supply and leave the packing and the export to Chinese-owned groups, it might work better. But if it's fully within their control, I think it's going to be, they'll find it challenging with the overall US-China relationship at the moment, which is quite volatile.
Ian Lahav there. And that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can stay up to date with all the news on our Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. The paper will be out tomorrow morning, and between you and me, the front page story is a cracker. The sound engineer this week was the lovely Sarah Gray, and I'm Hannah Quinn Mulligan.
The Irish Farmers Journal podcast, online at farmersjournal.ie and on iTunes every Thursday.